If I could speak to my grandfather today, I would say, I am sorry we still have to be here to rededicate ourselves to finishing your work and ultimately realizing your hidden dream.
60 years after that momentous march on Washington. 60 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s stirring speech. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Caleb sitting in for Annelise, and you are watching The Heat. Without question, it was a formative period in modern American history. On a sultry summer day back in 1963, hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. to hear celebrated civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr.'s second protest against the systematic repression of Black Americans. And as CGTN's Nathan King reports, 6 decades later, that quest for equality still continues.
60 years down the line, freedom.
60 years ago this week, this iconic memorial to Lincoln, the emancipator of the slaves, of course, became extremely famous because of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He was the last speaker that day, but in many ways, the March on Washington 60 years ago was an absolute first.
I looked out over the crowd. There were green people, blue people, white people, black people. I saw all those people standing up for what was just and what was right. The most important thing that day were the people. That was it. It wasn't the speeches or anything like that, it was the people.
The success of this march 60 years ago cannot be underestimated. Within a year, the Civil Rights Act was passed. A year later, the Voting Rights Act was passed. But America was still not done, and still not done today. Many people here say this is not a remembrance, this is not a commemoration, this is a continuation. They see 21st century America still trying to deliver on the promise, the dream of Martin Luther King and other activists that day. Voting rights are under attack, they say. They say that economic opportunities still predominantly go against African Americans, and still much needs to be done.
It's not, the word lynching, it just comes in different forms. But the lynching is still going on, and that's day to day. Education is being attacked. Everything is being attacked that we have fought for and still fighting for, and it's every day. With our children going to school, people not getting jobs and being paid fairly.
And as we enter this presidential election season, it's a reminder to people here and across the country that the divisions 60 years ago still very much exist in American society, even though the African American community and other communities disadvantaged have come a long way. A lot more work still needs to be done. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
Now, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Imani Cheers. She serves as the Interim Senior Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education at George Washington University and is an Associate Professor of Media and Public Affairs. And out of Vermont, Annelise Orleck is a Professor of History at Dartmouth College. Joseph Williams, a former Senior Editor at U.S. News and World Report, and Clarence Lusane is a professor and former chairman of the Department of Political Science at Howard University. I want to thank you all. It's great to see you all. Clarence, I want to begin with you. Picking up on the tone of Nathan's story there, it has been 60 years since the March on Washington, and I think everybody is struck by the fact that they're not talking about a commemoration, but rather a continuation, and it seems almost shallow, to be honest with you, in some ways, to talk about that when that same weekend in Jacksonville, Florida, we had a shooting death that can only be attributed to racial hatred.
Yes, that's certainly right to connect those two. It's important to have these remembrances and these commemorations because it becomes a time to really do look at where you've been, how people struggled, but also to gather people and to re-energize the movement. And so it was important to call this 60-year march because we are at a precipice. And what we've witnessed, particularly in the last few years, are some very dramatic rises in racial injustice, racial violence. Much of it being led by one of the political parties that I would argue has given a green light, has given sanction to some of the really extremist and white nationalist forces in the country. And a lot of that, of course, was raised at the march on Saturday, at the rally on Saturday. But these marches really are important, and doing them, periodically, particularly on anniversaries. The 20th was important. That was in 1983. That was the march where the calls were "Run, Jesse, Run," because Jesse Jackson was emerging and leading the movement against what many felt were pushbacks by the Reagan administration. Of course, 10 years ago, in 2013, we had elected a Black president. He had just been reelected. But we also saw the emergence of the Tea Party movement, right, which I would argue becomes the foundation for the MAGA movement, which is where we're at today. So it really is important to link the past with the present and to use the present to talk about building for the future.
Imani, I want to pick up on what Clarence said about sanctioning these kind of actions, because I can't help but to think back on Charlottesville, Virginia, and at that point in time, if leaders from both parties would have come out in a very powerful fashion and really decried what happened there, could things possibly be different today?
Unfortunately, I don't think they would have been. We realize, and we can all unfortunately remember when the current president at the time referred to the statement of good people on both sides. And that was just a continuing rallying cry for what we see now, what we'll continue to see. There is still a major part of this country, millions and millions of people that subscribe to just a racist doctrine. And that's what we've seen over the weekend. That's what we saw in Charlottesville. That's what we saw in Buffalo. Unfortunately, the list of these white supremacist incidents continue to occur and continue to be on the rise. But the commemoration today, and where we're looking at 60 years later, I truly believe is a point for us to ultimately be prepared for the present and the future, because we can't continue to look in the past, especially nostalgically.
A quick follow-up, if I may. After the march back in '63, we saw the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act. Look at where the United States is now. One can easily make the argument that all of these have been whittled away, and people of color have a very difficult time, very different time, really, doing things such as voting, and affirmative action losing ground as well.
Absolutely. We have seen not only an erosion of what truly were major legislative accomplishments, but that erosion has come quite swiftly over the last, I would argue, 20 years. And it continues to be. I am deeply, deeply concerned. I have a 9-year-old son. I'm deeply concerned for his future, especially as a Black boy growing into a Black man in the United States, and just really what that means for him when we have systems in place that are constantly being not only supported, but being enhanced by, again, these white supremacist political parties that we have.
Annelise, when we think about the March on Washington back in '63, and we had the one elderly gentleman talk about it, there were people of all colors there that day, and just a sea of people. We really don't see that too much nowadays, do we?
You were all speaking. I was thinking about the uprisings of the summer of 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd. And those actually involved a broader cross-section of the American population than even the civil rights struggle leading up to the March on Washington. And I think it's really important to remember that we're not commemorating a day, we're commemorating a movement. And that the March on Washington 60 years ago came at a time, in the middle of a decade of upheaval and grassroots protest. The uprisings in the summer of 2020 involved some staggering numbers. I believe it was 1 in 12 American families had young people participate in in those struggles, and they came from all backgrounds. And I think that, and I'm kind of a professional optimist, even though these are bleak times, I think that how many young people were involved in those protests is a cause for hope, and is a suggestion to me as a historian that despite what Imani just rightfully said, how frightening it is how quickly the Supreme Court and state legislatures have overturned legislation protecting voting rights and housing rights and rights in the workplace and women's rights to their bodies. The involvement of all those young people suggests to me that we will still be moving forward on the promises that were spoken that day 60 years ago.
Joseph, good to see you again. I want to start with a couple of financial figures, although, when you talk about human rights, it's very difficult to equate economic rights, but still very, very important in our society. Black Americans earn about 20% less than their white counterparts, even with identical college degrees, and 1 in 3 black children live in poverty compared to 1 in 10 children, white children. What do you think of this? What could be done to address this? And I hate to say, are you shocked that Congress and state legislatures aren't doing more to address these ills?
Can more be done? Yeah, absolutely. Am I shocked that more isn't done? No, not at all. And I think part and parcel of that is the fact that we have a polarization in the country that's not unlike what it was in 1968, 1960, in the late 60s during the height of the movement. But the difference there was the Democrats were the party of resistance, and they were largely a Southern bloc. Now the Democrats are the party of progressivism, and the Republicans in the South are the party of the resistance. The main difference, however, is the fact that of the two parties, the Republicans have managed to do some political jiggering and game the rules and game the system a little bit to kind of lock in the kind of power that keeps those kinds of sweeping changes like the Civil Rights Act, like the Voting Rights Act, like any presidential decree that would foment any economic power. They've kept that from happening because back then you had liberal Republicans from the North that banded together with some centrist Democrats to get stuff done. Now you have not even a whit of that happening because of the polarizations of the two parties. Now you could also argue that the Republicans have moved further to the right than the Democrats have moved further to the left, because you still have a semblance of centrist Democrats. And you can look to two centrist Democrats to see exactly why these things are no longer happening, at least if you look at the Senate. So I think also the economic argument was very much at the core of what Martin Luther King was arguing that day. I mean, a lot of people have reduced his speech to the "I have a dream" phrase, but certainly he was arguing for economic power, and he was arguing for equal treatment. It was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. Jobs and freedom, not just freedom. So I think that economics are very much a part of the story. I don't think anyone should shy away from tying economics to civil rights, because we live in a capitalist society and because these things matter.
And Joseph, to follow up, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. King was in Memphis working with sanitation unions in an economic fashion as well. So really, this went on and on and on for years.
That's exactly right. The last sermon of his life, he preached in support of striking garbage workers in Memphis, because that was a job back then that could get you killed for a poor wage. And I think one of the things that people tend to forget, especially when they're talking about the organization March on Washington, Bayard Rustin is one of the principal organizers, along with A. Phil Randolph. Those two men were union activists. They saw how unions and how banding together for collective action could make a difference in American society, particularly when it comes to economics, because the bosses are not going to give away money without a fight. They're not going to give you a fair wage and fair treatment without a fight, and certainly even less so if the people asking for fair treatment are black. So there is a long way to go in this movement. There are some problems between labor and race, and that's one of the reasons why we had a couple of issues with Bernie Sanders, and why he didn't necessarily struggle to gain support from black voters. But it all ties together, it's all factored in, and it's all a part of the struggle throughout history.
Clarence, U.S. President Biden writing an op-ed in the Washington Post touting his Bidenomics, his economic plan, saying he's doing a lot to improve the lives of black Americans. But just this past week, I was down in Atlanta for the indictments of Trump. And I talked to the NAACP there, and he said that there is more than just simmering frustration among blacks in the United States, because in 2020 there were promises made that they would attack the student loan program, they would attack voting rights, they would attack the shedding, if you will, of other civil rights. What do you think about that? Was it a fair comment? And his argument at the time was he thinks that African Americans could sit on the sidelines during this upcoming election because they're often taken for granted as a voting bloc.
So I think there's no question that there are unfulfilled promises, as often is the case. And so certainly student loans, for example, which affects a large body of folks, but disproportionately tends to affect students of color. There's lots of data that supports that. The democracy agenda that many African Americans, others call for, Biden came too late to the game, but it was pretty clear from the 4 years of the Trump administration and from what we're seeing around the country that there were attacks on democracy. And again, disproportionately, I would argue, impacting on people of color. But what people have to remember is, what is the alternative? And if the alternative is MAGA back in power, and Donald Trump has made it clear that he will run an administration based on retribution, who is that going to be aimed at? And he's also been clear that he's called people like Fonnie down in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Fonnie Willis, yes.
Fonnie Willis, Tish James up in New York. He's called these people racist, right? So he's laying the foundations for a racial assault come a second Trump administration. So we have to be clear, as much as there may be disappointments about what the Biden administration has done and has not done. But I think, as my colleague pointed out, it's really critical to see that on the other side, there's an even more existential threat. And so it's going to be really important, not only that the Biden administration, but African-American leaders are clear in transition and putting out that the 2024 election really is about where the country is going to go. And when we come back in 20 years for the 80th anniversary of March on Washington, will it be that we had a setback that we just could not even imagine, or will we have made at least some progress because we beat back some of the most reactionary forces in the country?
Imani, I got to give a shout out to our producer for starting our program with Martin Luther King Jr.'s granddaughter speaking. I thought that was nice. And if you think back to 1963, there really weren't that many women who were speaking out at that time, but how things have changed. The granddaughter at the speech over the weekend, of course, Bernice King, such a successful lawyer and civil rights activist as well. And Al Sharpton, in coming down, said that he really got his marching orders from Coretta Scott King. So are we seeing more women out there leading this push?
Absolutely, and I think we should also remember, the Honorable Dorothy Height, who stood, at the podium. We have to remember Mahalia Jackson. We have to remember all the women who were so involved in not only the March for Jobs and Freedom, but also just in general in the civil rights movement and just the legacy of progression for all movements. There are always women, in particular Black women in this case. And we're seeing a number of Black women currently and contemporarily who are absolutely as activists and as scholars and who are the ones who are really on the forefront of having these larger conversations, on the forefront of legislatures, they're on the forefront of the Supreme Court. And so we have made some significant progress for Black women, but even going to where my colleague mentioned about the finances, I mean, Black women are still, although one of the most educated demographics in the United States of America, are also significantly underpaid to their white female counterparts, their Asian and Hispanic counterparts. So we're still, although we've come a significant long way to seeing women, Black women in particular, in the forefront, we also have an astronomical way to go.
Okay, Annelise, 2023, we've seen SCOTUS, as you mentioned, basically dissolve affirmative action, diminish LGBTQ rights. not to mention the rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States. The Washington Post quoting Andrea Waters King, the wife of Martin Luther King III, saying that, quote, "We are seeing oppression being legislated." Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with the new GOP House majority, there's an attack on all of the rights that were won in those years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, as you mentioned. They have Clarence Thomas, Justice Thomas, in the aftermath of the decision, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, said that, you know, the next decisions coming down could be around LGBTQ rights, marriage equality, as well as interracial marriage. So there's definitely an assault in the courts and in the legislatures. But I think we're starting to see the mobilization of a new generation of voters, you know, with Gen X. And I think I read that Gen X and millennials together will make up 40% of the electorate in the coming years, in 2024 and more in 2028. They're a very tuned-in generation. They are a generation that is very interested in racial and social justice.
But do you think they will be active and go to the polls? That's the big thing.
I do. I mean, we saw unprecedented participation in 2018, 2020, and 2022. Although the 2022 numbers were not as impressive as the previous two elections, they still were high enough to suggest that this idea that young people don't go to the polls, and particularly young people of color don't go to the polls, and young queer people don't go to the polls, is no longer true. So I see that mobilization, and I think we cannot underestimate the mobilizing power of overturning Roe. I think that we're seeing it all across the country. We've seen it in special elections, local elections, and this is an issue that affects women of color most of all. So I think, you know, without question, there's an assault in the legislature, but there is also a response from the young people and from grassroots activists.
You know, Joseph, sadly, racial injustice is kind of a time-honored tradition in the United States, you know, obviously going back to Native Americans. And one could argue not a whole lot has changed. Now, during 1967, we did see a similar racially charged environment in which the Kerner Commission came out and was in an effort to curtail riots in the future. I want to read you a quote and get your response to this. Quote, "What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintained it, and white society condones it." Your thoughts?
I think we're only now starting to get our heads around what that actually meant, because in recent years, we've started talking more and more about redlining. We started talking more and more about community disinvestment. We've talked about how schools are funded by property taxes. Now, this is all against a backdrop where you had an official government policy that kept people from investing, kept mortgage brokers out of certain neighborhoods based on population and based on race. That's only now starting to be reckoned with. Also, we were not really had the language, we didn't really have the intellect or the language to start talking about why taxes are funded to schools and how that hurts communities, and how communities of color basically have been forced into the far corners in some of the worst areas of cities and urban landscapes. We haven't even touched on the fact that there's environmental racism that's afoot, where my grandmother had a house that was down the street from a paint factory, and my uncle had a house that was down the street from a trash incinerator. I mean, and these are things that happened in my lifetime, and they still have not been fully reckoned with. We have a movement about social and environmental justice. We need to focus in on that, along with economics, along with voting rights. It all becomes a factor. And a lot of this was condoned through official policies, through the minutiae of like zoning and school boards and those sorts of legislative actions that people don't really pay attention to. And now we have a divided Congress where even under full Democratic control, it was very difficult because you had some centrists who were uneasy about how this looked and about whether or not you were giving special carve-outs. We haven't even touched on affirmative action in schools. All of these were official policies. All of them were retrenched to some degree by the Civil Rights Act and those official decrees, but now we're seeing a regression. And it's unfortunate that there aren't enough people or aren't enough people with courage who are able to stop it.
And gerrymandering arguably making it much worse. Clarence, at the top of the program, I talked to you about racial violence. I want you to listen to what the Reverend Al Sharpton had to say this weekend.
Hate jumped back up again to remind us that we're not there yet. Those folks in that dollar store weren't marching. They weren't agitating. They were just black going shopping. Which reminds every one of you, until we can fight all of this racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and misogyny, till we get rid of all of it, all of us could be the next victim.
I think a lot of people really have trouble getting their head around the fact, how could someone hate so much they want to walk into a place with a semi-automatic rifle?
So the FBI has made it clear. The #1 danger domestically is white nationalist violence. This has been the case for some time now, but there has not been an adequate response by those who should be doing the responding. So we're likely to see, sadly, tragically, even more, unfortunately. And some of this will be organized and collective, but a lot of it will be these individual actors who have become radicalized, who have become hate-filled, in part because of what they're hearing 24/7 on some of the media and social media sites.
Right. And
that is creating an atmosphere that we really have to give a priority to if we're going to have a chance of preventing these kinds of tragedies.
Imani, I want to end the program with you, and unfortunately you have a little bit less than a minute to answer this question, but I'm taken about what you said earlier about having a 9-year-old son. Have you had the talk with your son yet? And what, if you haven't, what's that going to be like?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I had to have this talk well earlier with my son than I would have hoped. And he was asking during the lockdown and COVID in March and April of 2020, who was Breonna Taylor, who was Ahmaud Arbery, in these names, who was, of course, George Floyd. So we've had to have this conversation. I actually ended up convening, at the time he was just finishing 2nd grade, and I had to convene a conversation. I reached out to some of his parents, and we, as parents of students in his class, because these were other children, predominantly white children, and we had a really amazing conversation about these topics. So it's important to have, and other communities should have them as well.
I want to thank all members of our panel. I really appreciate it. It's been a very eye-opening discussion for me, and we're going to leave it there. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. As always, thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.